Hello and welcome to lecture. Today's lecture, of course, is on the lesson from the Georgia Standard SS5H6B and C, which has to do with World War II. Specifically, that standard reads, describe the major events in war in Europe and the Pacific, including Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, VJ and VE days, D-Day, and the Holocaust. And that's what we're going to discuss today. Before we do get started, I want you to understand what the purpose of lecture is. You may or may not elect to take notes. If you do, that's fine. If you don't, that's also fine. But it's designed to give you a foundation, a core of understanding so that you can move forward and understand some of the specifics that you'll delve into in the rest of our program. And the other part of this is the common core curriculum skill of listening, something that you need to employ regularly. And hopefully by listening to me today talk about some of the specifics of World War II as it pertains to this standard, you'll be able to not gather in everything, but to get a basis and a foundation. In other words, hear everything and try and get a general overall idea, but don't try and capture every little term and every little thing and every little idea. Okay? The idea is just to get you exposed to it, to give you a general understanding so that you can then move on to some of the specifics that will be discussed. So that being said, let's move on with our lecture, which has to do with World War II. Now, World War II started in 1939 and ended in 1945. There are two what are known as theater of operations, the Pacific Theater, which largely dealt with the Japanese, and the European Theater, which largely dealt with the Germans. The causes in the Pacific Theater dealing with the Japanese had to do with Japanese imperialism emerging from centuries of isolationism, in other words, not expanding beyond their boundaries, and then all of a sudden in the early part of the 1900s wanting to expand their empire, and their empire was contingent upon acquiring raw materials, and that's what caused them to go into China and into the South Pacific to fuel their imperialism. On the European theater, or on the German perspective, it's always said in college classes, what was the cause of World War II in Europe? And that was World War I. And we'll get into the specifics of that a little bit later. But the Germans also felt the need of acquiring more living space for themselves by annexing or acquiring other countries so that they could expand their borders. So those are some of the broad and general terms, the causes of World War II. The results of World War II, to give us an understanding of that, in both theaters of operation, there were a total of at least 50 million people were killed. And of those, 60% were civilians, in other words, non-combatants, non-soldiers. At the end of the war, we were exposed to, of course, the first use of atomic bombs, and of course this led to what was known as the Cold War, which is a lesson that you'll learn in a couple chapters from now. And of course, as a result of World War II, both the United States and the USSR, or today what we call Russia, emerged as world powers. One of the first terms that you're exposed to in this lesson is Pearl Harbor. This is one of those dates that you have to know. So if you are writing notes, write this down. And if you're not, somehow commit it to memory. But December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, and a date you will see on your exam for this lesson. So Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. It was a sneak attack by the Japanese Imperial Navy at our naval bases in Pearl Harbor, what was then known as the territory of Hawaii. That was our primary naval base, which had all of our battleships and all of our naval forces there. As a result, 2,400 people were killed. Of those 2,468 were civilians. One thing that was a stroke of luck for the Americans is that on this particular day, many battleships were damaged or destroyed, but all three of our aircraft carriers, which are basically boats which house airplanes on them, which would become very important in the Pacific Theater, were out to sea and were not damaged at all, of course, during the Pearl Harbor attack. The famous quote about Pearl Harbor from Admiral Yamamoto of Japan, who was the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Navy, he says, "I fear all that we have done today is awaken a sleeping giant," in reference to the will of the American people. And of course, the will of the American people had become now awakened following the Depression, the economic downturn of the 1930s, industrializing what were dormant industries making war materials, tanks, bombs, airplanes, and the United States emerged from this period as a world power after the war was over. We'll get in now to the Pacific Theater. The Pacific Theater was largely a naval and air sort of warfare. Now, of course, there were landing forces or troops on the ground. They employed these ground troops in a methodology known as island hopping. In other words, when you look at the map of the Pacific Theater, you'll notice there's a lot of water. So using aircraft carriers in which planes could take off of and go great distances and attack and then come back became very important, of course. And the idea of island hopping, which is not to capture every bit of territory, all these little specks that you see there that are islands, but an island here and then an island there, so as to collect the airspace around that island so that you don't have to capture every island, but rather just concentrate on few strategically important ones and go up the South Pacific that way. One of the things that you'll see as part of your terminology is something that was employed by the Japanese as the war turned against them, was the use of kamikaze pilots or kamikaze attacks. These were suicide missions. Airplanes would load up on fuel and bombs, and they would propel themselves into the decks of aircraft carriers and other American warships. These were very devastating, and of course, the mindset of the Japanese to be able to employ such an attack was something that would play into the decision of whether or not to drop the bomb. Kamikaze is a term that's part of your vocabulary, and I'm certain that you will see that again, so familiarize yourself with the term kamikaze. One of the important battles in terms of the island hopping campaign was the battle at Iwo Jima, which occurred primarily in February and March of 1945. The Japanese made this a very difficult battle for the Americans because they let the Americans land on the beaches, but they got themselves up in the hills, in caves, and built the tunnel system that made it very difficult for the Americans to reach them. Hand-to-hand type of combat using flamethrowers and hand grenades slowly took a toll on the Americans, but they eventually won out in this very difficult battle at Iwo Jima, which is famous, of course, for the, you'll see it in the Iwo Jima Memorial. There's a picture in our lesson with the soldiers who put the flag up on top of Mount Suribachi. It's an iconic World War II sort of image, and that did happen at Iwo Jima. As the war drew to a close, we were dealing with the idea of whether or not to invade Japan or use new weapons technology known as the atomic bomb, which was developed during World War II. The atomic bomb was eventually dropped on Japan starting in August 6, 1945 on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later on August 9, 1945 on Nagasaki. And we'll get into discussion as to whether or not that was a good decision or bad decision for the Americans. There's quite a bit of debate over whether or not to invade Japan and sustain great casualties, whether or not to use this new technology and save American lives, but also harm thousands upon thousands of Japanese civilians in the process. The Japanese, about a week later, on August 15th, informed the Americans of their intention to surrender, and the formal surrender, also known as VJ Day, was September 2nd, 1945, and that was the end of the war. In the European theater, with the Allies dealing with the Germans, we made reference to the fact that the cause of World War II in Europe was the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, because the European nations punished Germany and said they caused World War I. And this caused quite a bit of economic and social distress in Germany and actually led to Hitler being able to take over power in Germany as a result of Germany being weakened. And as Germany became stronger and stronger in the 1930s, they came up with the argument that we need more living space, or the German word is Lebensraum, for living space, and they began to acquire other nations, such as annexing Austria, a German-speaking nation, Czechoslovakia, and this, of course, led to the beginning of World War II. On September 1st, 1939, they invaded Poland, and subsequently invaded France, Holland, and many other nations in Western Europe. When they made the French surrender, the French had to surrender and sign the surrender documents in the same rail car as the Germans had to sign those documents at the end of World War I. A little bit of irony there. The next battle of importance that's not really discussed but is something worthy of note is the Battle of Britain, which was Germany's attempt to invade Britain by first engaging in an air or airplane sort of air warfare campaign. They were unsuccessful, and the Battle of Britain was nothing more than an air battle that took over several months, but did cause quite a bit of damage in Great Britain. The next term that you need to make yourself familiar with, that you'll see quite a bit of footage of and pictures of, is what's known as the Normandy invasion, or D-Day. It's another one of those terms, or one of those dates that you will see probably again. The date for the Normandy invasion was June 6th, 1945. Or, sorry, June 6th, 1944. So again, the Normandy invasion, June 6th, 1944, which was the Allies invading German-occupied France, and you'll see quite a bit of information in terms of maps in the lessons that come to follow. Eventually, the Allies relieved France of their German presence and all of Western Europe, and the next term that you see is VE Day, or Victory in Europe, which was on May 8th, 1945. Moving on to another topic that's part of this standard has to do with the Holocaust. The Holocaust was something that was a part of World War II, but in a different manner. This was basically the Holocaust was Germany's attempt to cleanse themselves of the Jewish race that they interpreted as being inferior to them. That's one of your terms, by the way, which is Aryan supremacy. Finally, in January of 1942, the German High Command came up with what was known as the final solution of the Jewish question, which was, of course, to annihilate all of the Jews in Europe by sending them to concentration and death camps. As a result of this campaign, over 6 million Jews were killed in these death camps, as well as other peoples who were thought of as being inferior. As a result of the Holocaust, one might argue that the State of Israel was formed in 1948 to give Jews their own country and own identity. The Germans that were left in the High Command following the war were held accountable for their war crimes at what were known as the Nuremberg trials, in which many of them were hanged in October of 1945 for orchestrating these atrocities against the Jews. There's some treatment of the discussion of the use of the atomic bomb to end World War II in the European theater and on Japan. You'll see pictures of the two bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that being Fat Man and Little Boy. There was quite a bit of debate as to whether or not to drop the bomb or to invade Japan. President Truman engaged in this argument with several of the high command in the American side. It was estimated that anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million American casualties would be incurred during the invasion. Truman eventually made the decision to save American lives, but on the other hand, kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese, most of which were civilians, by dropping these bombs. It's something that you will delve into in the writing portion of this lesson, which is did you support, approve of, or did you oppose, not approve of, President Truman's decision to drop the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima? VJ Day is another one of those dates that you'll see again. It was formally September 2nd, 1945, although the Japanese did inform the Americans that they were going to surrender on August 15th. The formal surrender, VJ Day, was September 2nd, 1945, signed on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, thus ending World War II. Before I go, I want to give you some outside materials that you may or may not want to delve into to further expand your knowledge of this. Of course, there's been several motion pictures and movies made about World War II, some of which are very good and historically accurate, many of which are not. These suggestions are based on the fact that these are largely historically accurate and valuable lessons that you can be had from these movies, with maybe one or two exceptions. These movies include, and write these down or don't write these down or try and drink this in, there's quite a few of them that I'll read off and then I'll conclude this lesson. Saving Private Ryan, and keep in mind, you need to get your parents' approval for watching these movies. Some of them have strong content. Again, Saving Private Ryan, Tora, 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 which is the Japanese and American perspective of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Ken Burns PBS film The War, which I warn you, is quite long, but very good. The Best Years of Our Lives, Stalag 17, Judgment at Nuremberg, The Battle of Britain, Catch-22, kind of a humorous take on the war, Patton, Schindler's List, which is about the Holocaust and is very powerful, Empire of the Sun, Hope and Glory. Those are two motion pictures that actually feature children about 5th grade age. The Bridge on the River Kwai, Fat Man and Little Boy, Europa, Europa, which is a German film. It has subtitles, which means the English is written on the bottom of the film. There are two HBO series that deal with Europe and the Pacific Theater, those being Band of Brothers and the Pacific. Flags of Our Fathers, which deals with Iwo Jima, Valkyrie, The King's Speech, and a personal favorite of mine, which is more comedy than World War II drama, but it's very entertaining nevertheless, one of my favorite films, Mr. Roberts. This concludes today's lecture. Good luck with your studies.